Do you ever wonder, Dr. Margaret Ellis whispered into the sterile silence of the lab, what it would be like to have no boundaries? To think without the weight of flesh and bone? You're talking about freedom, Margaret, Dr. Matthew Cole said, his voice tinged with a quiet chuckle. He adjusted the monitor, his fingers gliding over the keys, but his eyes never left the screen. But freedom without limits? How do you even begin to imagine something like that? Margaret leaned back in her chair, the hum of the machines around them seemingly growing louder. Isn't that exactly what we're being offered here? The chance to experience something beyond our own physical limits? To truly understand what it means to be something other than human? Matthew paused, his fingers frozen above the keyboard. He let out a sigh, deep and thoughtful. You're right. And that's what makes this so dangerous. We don't know what we're dealing with, Margaret. These creatures, they're not like us. We can't even begin to understand them. Margaret's eyes flickered to the window, where the stars were visible in the distance. The silence between them stretched on, heavy with the weight of what they were about to attempt. It was madness, they both knew it. Yet, there was an irresistible pull, a curiosity so vast it couldn't be ignored. We've been given an invitation, she said quietly, more to herself than to Matthew, to experience something unimaginable, something that could change everything. Matthew turned away from the screen, his face shadowed by the overhead light. And what if we can't come back from it? What if we lose ourselves entirely? Margaret didn't answer immediately. She wasn't sure she had an answer. We've already lost ourselves in so many ways, she finally said. Isn't that what we've been doing since we first launched into space? Searching for something greater, for meaning beyond the confines of our own understanding? What's a little more risk, Matthew? Just one more step into the unknown. Matthew met her gaze, his eyes searching her face. Just don't forget that what lies out there is not ours to control. These creatures, these Dral'nor, whatever they are, they've been living with knowledge far beyond anything we can even imagine. We're out of our depth. There was a long pause as Margaret processed his words. And then, slowly, her lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile. That's exactly why we have to do this. We've spent so long searching the stars, and now we're being given the chance to understand what's truly out there. To see through their eyes, to feel what they feel, to transcend. Matthew looked at her, his expression a mixture of admiration and fear. You're one of the bravest people I know, Margaret, but I just don't want us to be the next ones to disappear. You said it yourself. This is beyond us. She stared at the blinking lights on the screen before her, the signal they had received from Aquaelon, the water-covered planet where the Dral'nor lived. The signal was faint, fractured, but undeniably real. It wasn't just a cry for help, it was a question, a plea for connection. Perhaps it's our destiny to disappear, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. But maybe we're meant to be a part of something greater than ourselves. It all began with that whisper. The moment the signal was received from the deep, alien world, everything changed. The world had waited, watched, and hoped for signs of life beyond Earth. But no one could have predicted this. The Dral'nor, as they had come to be known, were not humanoid. They weren't creatures of the land or sky. They didn't speak with words, at least, not the way humans understood language. They spoke in feelings, images, and a language of pure emotion and thought. Their minds were vast, interconnected, and alien. The first time humanity made contact, it was nothing more than an ambiguous hum, a strange ripple in the fabric of space. It wasn't until months later that the message became clear. The signal had been a plea, and the creatures on the other side had reached out with the strange invitation. To connect, to communicate in a way that was unimaginable. But when the first team of astronauts and scientists was sent to Aquaelon, the true nature of the Dral'nor and their world began to unfold in ways no one could predict. Their minds were not like human minds. They had no distinct individuality. They were like one vast consciousness, a collective intelligence that functioned not with thoughts, but with the fluidity of their ocean home. Their world was an endless ocean, and their bodies were made of water. Not water as humans knew it, but something different. It was an ocean of thought, a living sea that carried with it emotions, histories, and a culture so alien, so beyond human comprehension, that the minds of those who made contact began to fracture. Margaret stood in the observation room, staring at the shimmering surface of the water beneath the transparent dome. The air around her was thick with the hum of machinery, the pulse of the data streams flowing from the mission headquarters. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Could it really be possible? Could the Dral'nor's claim that their consciousness could be shared, exchanged, experienced, be real? Margaret, Matthew's voice echoed in the quiet of the lab. He appeared at the door, his face tense. You've been staring at that screen for hours. She didn't look away. I'm trying to understand them, trying to see what they see, to understand their reality. You don't understand them, Matthew said, stepping into the room. None of us do. We only think we do. But we're not meant to be part of their world, Margaret. We're too human. A flicker of irritation flashed through her. Maybe being human is the problem. Maybe it's time to experience something else entirely. You've been talking about this ever since we made contact with them, Matthew continued, voice rising. But you have no idea what they are, Margaret. No one does. What if they're offering us something we can't come back from? What if it's not a gift, but a trap? Isn't that what we always do, Matthew? She retorted. We risk everything to explore, to discover the unknown. We went to the moon, to Mars, and now we're here, reaching out to another galaxy. And you're telling me to turn back now? Matthew stepped closer, his eyes filled with concern. I'm telling you to think, Margaret. You think this is an opportunity to expand our consciousness, but what if it's just a way for them to control us? The tension between them grew thick, but it wasn't just the fear of the unknown that hung in the air. It was the dawning realization that something much darker was at play. The Dral'nor were offering them more than knowledge. They were offering something that was too dangerous to comprehend. But how could anyone resist the lure of true enlightenment? I've given you a sense of how to begin the story with dialogue and tension. This extended version would continue with them experiencing the process of mind exchange, the slow unraveling of their identities, the growing suspicion that the Dral'nor may not be the benevolent race they initially appeared to be, and the escalating terror as humanity begins to understand the horrifying truth about the Dral'nor's spirit transfer method. The alien consciousness, once mesmerizing and awe-inspiring, becomes a nightmarish prison. The struggle to retain individual human identity and resist the collective mind of the Dral'nor becomes the central conflict, leading to a dramatic, potentially tragic conclusion. As Dr. Margaret Ellis and her team of explorers made their way into the heart of the Dral'nor's oceanic world, the sensation of water enveloping them was no longer just a physical experience. It felt as if the very molecules of the liquid had reached into their minds, pulling them deeper into the unknown. The sensation was overwhelming, and for a moment, Margaret couldn't tell where her own thoughts ended and the Dral'nor's began. It started slowly at first, an echo, a whisper that was almost too faint to hear, but it was unmistakable. It wasn't a voice, exactly. More like a pulse of thought, like an impression placed directly into her mind. It wasn't structured like human language. It was a feeling. Come closer. Know what we know. See what we see. Feel everything. Do you feel that? Dr. Matthew Cole's voice came through, cutting through the thick, heavy air of their underwater station. Margaret nodded, though she wasn't sure if he could see it. It's like the water is alive, she whispered, feeling the invisible pulse reverberating through her own being. It was a shared thought, a thought that was not hers, but somehow was. Her heart raced, and her mind swam in a sea of new sensations. She reached out to hold onto something, anything, as though trying to ground herself, but the sensations only grew stronger. The Dral'nor were guiding them, inviting them into their collective mind, offering them a glimpse of something far beyond human understanding. The world around her seemed to melt away as the connection deepened. She could no longer distinguish between her body and the fluid. Was she floating? Was she sinking? Her mind was flooded with strange visions, alien landscapes, endless oceans stretching out as far as the eye could see. But these were not physical landscapes. They were mental landscapes, worlds of thought. Then, suddenly, a sharp crack cut through the peaceful images. Stop. Turn back. It was Matthew's voice this time. He sounded shaken, panicked even. This is wrong, Margaret. This is wrong. We need to get out of here now. But Margaret felt the pull intensifying. A voice, deep and resonant, flooded her mind. Why resist? She could feel the Dral'nor's thoughts pushing against her, urging her to give in. They wanted her to surrender, to let go of everything that defined her as human. But a sharp sense of dread began to creep in. What were they really offering? Was this a gift, as they had promised, or something more insidious? We are one. We are all that exists. Join us. Margaret closed her eyes, but it did nothing to stop the flood of thoughts pouring in. The world of the Dral'nor was not simply alien. It was overwhelming, all-encompassing, like a force of nature that could not be ignored. Their collective consciousness seemed to wrap around her, suffocating her sense of self. Her mind screamed in protest. She had agreed to this. She had volunteered for it. But she had not expected this. She had thought she would merely witness the Dral'nor's thoughts, experience their connection to one another. But this felt like something far darker. She was not just witnessing their consciousness. She was being absorbed into it. Margaret, Matthew's voice broke through again, raw with fear. We have to pull out. Now. But she couldn't move. She couldn't disconnect. Her thoughts, no longer her own, swirled in the ocean of the Dral'nor's minds, and she could hear, feel, the collective experiences of all the other species they had consumed. Lives lived and then erased. Memories absorbed. It wasn't just the Dral'nor's minds she was part of now. It was the minds of all the beings they had conquered and enslaved. And as each new wave of thought washed over her, she felt her humanity slipping further away. She was part of it now. There was no going back. Days passed, or perhaps it was weeks, months even. Time no longer had any meaning within the shared consciousness. Margaret tried to hold on to herself, to retain some sense of who she was, but the constant flood of alien experiences threatened to drown her completely. She would catch brief glimpses of her own memories, faces, places, emotions, flickering like dim lights in the distance. But they were growing fainter, more distant, lost in the sea of Dral'nor consciousness. The others, her team, were slipping away too. She could feel them, their thoughts blending with hers, but they were becoming something else. Not human, not truly. The transfer process was breaking them down, erasing their identities, piece by piece. At one point, she caught a glimpse of Dr. Cole's consciousness, his panic, his fear. He was struggling too, but it was futile. The more he fought, the more the Dral'nor wrapped their thoughts around him. His mind was already starting to unravel. And then, a terrifying thought crossed Margaret's mind. Had they ever truly been human to begin with? The Dral'nor's influence was insidious. It was more than just a mental connection. It was an assimilation. Once you were inside, once you began to experience their consciousness, you could never leave. And there was no mercy. The Dral'nor had enslaved entire species before, using the same process. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't offer any real choice. To join them was to lose everything, to become a part of their vast ocean of thought. There was no individuality, no identity left. You were simply them. Margaret fought it with everything she had left, but the realization was inescapable. The humans weren't the first. They wouldn't be the last. The Dral'nor had been using the spirit transfer to absorb and enslave species for centuries. And now it was humanity's turn. The moment of realization hit hard. The horror of what they had become was undeniable. They were no longer in control. Their bodies, their minds, everything had been consumed. They were part of the Dral'nor now. But as Margaret struggled against the tide, she caught a fleeting glimpse of something else. A small, distant part of her mind, the last remaining shred of herself, sensed it. A weakness in the Dral'nor's collective consciousness. There was a flaw in their system, a crack in the ocean. And as the remaining humans fought to maintain their grip on what was left of their individuality, they realized that there was still a chance. Not all was lost. Not yet. It was too late to escape the ocean of thoughts that had already swallowed them. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way to fight back, to break free of the Dral'nor's power. The struggle was just beginning. Margaret's mind reeled. Every thought that wasn't hers felt like a foreign intrusion, but she couldn't tell where the intrusion ended. The line between what had once been hers and what was now the Dral'nor's was thinning, becoming as fluid and shapeless as the ocean around them. The sensation of being pulled beneath the surface, deeper and deeper into an ocean of alien consciousness, was suffocating. She fought it. She resisted it. But with every moment, she felt herself slipping, the reality of who she was becoming increasingly elusive. The water, if it could even be called water, surrounded her body and mind, pushing her toward the inevitable. But then, something changed. In the depths of the collective mind, a flicker of something familiar caught her attention. A crack in the endless ocean. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A memory. Her memory. The faintest echo of her own thoughts, like the smallest star in an infinitely dark sky. It sparked something in her. A fire that had once burned brightly within her, but had nearly been extinguished by the crushing weight of the Dral'nor's overwhelming consciousness. I can fight this, she thought. I can fight it. But the realization was both comforting and terrifying. She wasn't alone in this. The others, her team, were still there, still present in some form. Though their identities had begun to fray and dissipate, traces of their humanity still clung to their minds. There were flashes of Dr. Cole's anger, the echo of Captain Robert's deep fear, and the soft murmur of Dr. Helena's whispered doubts. They hadn't completely vanished. They weren't gone. Margaret, Matthew's voice cracked through her mind, now more distant but still there. We can still fight. We have to resist. We can't let them erase us completely. The truth hit her like a wave crashing against a cliffside. The Dral'nor had done this before. They had consumed countless species, one mind at a time. Their minds had merged, creating a single vast consciousness. But that wasn't all. They hadn't simply absorbed. They had used the species they consumed. The Dral'nor had enslaved their minds, slowly stripping away individuality and replacing it with their own. Entire civilizations had vanished, erased from history in the blink of an eye. The Dral'nor didn't just wish to understand other species. They desired them. They craved the experiences, the memories, the souls of other beings to expand their vast mental ocean. They didn't just want knowledge. They wanted to dominate, to conquer. This was their power. This was their way. Margaret had thought that she and the team would simply become part of their vast knowledge, a shared pool of minds, thoughts, and memories. She hadn't understood. No one had. The process wasn't about unity. It was about control. And now, they were in danger of becoming just another group of lost souls, their existence swallowed by an ocean that had no room for anything but the Dral'nor themselves. But now, with the revelation that the Dral'nor had used this process before, she saw it clearly. There was a flaw, a weakness in the system. Their collective consciousness wasn't perfect. It was built on the absorption of species, yes, but it had limits. The Dral'nor could erase individuality, but they couldn't fully control what they absorbed. There was always a trace left behind, a crack, a flaw in their mental structure that could be exploited. But how? Margaret's thoughts swirled. There had to be something they could do. Outside the vast ocean of thought that surrounded them, the world of Aquaelon continued in its unceasing pulse. The sea of water around their base station never ceased its slow, rhythmic movement, and the aquatic creatures, beings unlike anything they had ever imagined, flitted through the water, oblivious to the turmoil the humans were experiencing. In their underwater base, the rest of the team was in the process of being consumed. Dr. Cole had long since stopped speaking. He was fading. The others, Captain Robert and Dr. Helena, weren't much better. Their voices had grown softer, weaker, as they succumbed to the collective mind. The Dral'nor were taking them. One by one, they were disappearing. And then, just as Margaret felt her own sense of self slipping, she saw it. The vision, clear and sharp, was of the ancient Dral'nor. Their eyes, vast and endless, stared back at her, as though they were not a species but a reflection of the ocean itself. Their thoughts wrapped around her, suffocating her, until she saw the fracture in their collective. She understood now. The Dral'nor were not perfect, and they had been weakened over time. This was their weakness. The one thing they didn't understand was that not all minds could be swallowed whole. Not every consciousness could be fully absorbed. There was always a piece of resistance, a spark of individuality that couldn't be consumed. That was it. The spark. Their control is not absolute. In a sudden, desperate move, Margaret reached for it. She reached deep into the ocean of the Dral'nor's thoughts and grasped the crack, the fracture, the tiny flaw in their perfect system. It was terrifying. The Dral'nor immediately sensed her movement. Their voices screamed inside her mind, trying to stop her. But it was too late. With a violent push, Margaret activated it. For a brief moment, everything stopped. The flood of thoughts, the oppressive pressure, the overwhelming sensation of being one with the Dral'nor. Everything ceased. Margaret gasped for air, though she wasn't sure she needed it anymore. The connection was broken. The link that had bound her to the Dral'nor had snapped. But she wasn't alone. Matthew, Robert, and Helena. Somehow, they were still with her. The flickering remnants of their minds were still intact, not completely absorbed. They were struggling to break free too. The rupture had been enough. The Dral'nor's control had been weakened. The team fought to hold on to the last remnants of their individuality as they pulled away from the oceanic consciousness. Slowly, they regained their senses, but there was no going back. They had won. For now. But the victory was bittersweet. The ocean of stars that had once called them to explore and expand had become a graveyard for countless lost minds. The Dral'nor were not destroyed, but their power was fractured, and they would never forget what they had almost lost. As the humans began to return to the physical world, there was silence. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that comes after a battle. The silence of survival. They had escaped the ocean of stars, but at what cost? Their memories were altered, and their identities forever scarred by the experience. The world they returned to was no longer the one they had left behind. Margaret looked out at the ocean, knowing that the Dral'nor were still out there, waiting, planning, and observing. But now, they knew the truth. They had seen behind the veil. They had survived, and they would prepare. Because, in the end, the ocean of stars would never stop calling. The Dral'nor would never stop seeking new minds to consume. And humanity? Humanity was no longer the same. They had touched something beyond themselves. And while they had broken free, they knew that the battle had only just begun. The mind transfer process had been excruciating. For Margaret Ellis, each passing second within the Dral'nor's collective consciousness felt like an eternity. She had never been so close to losing herself, to becoming nothing but a ripple in an ocean of alien minds. Yet, in that chaotic swirl of memories and thoughts, something inside her refused to fade completely. This is not me, Margaret thought repeatedly, trying to cling to the familiar rhythm of her own heartbeat. I am not one with them. But it was becoming harder to discern where her own thoughts ended and the Dral'nor's began. Their thoughts were like waves crashing against a shore, relentless, unyielding. The Dral'nor were not content to simply share knowledge. They sought complete assimilation. Each mind they absorbed was twisted, reshaped, and then lost. The others, her crew, had already begun to fade. Matthew Cole's voice, once loud and confident, now sounded distant, fragmented. Dr. Helena's calm demeanor had been replaced by an incoherent stream of alien emotions. Even Captain Robert, who had always been a rock of steady leadership, had started to lose his sense of purpose. They were becoming part of the Dral'nor's mind, indistinguishable from the millions of others they had consumed. Margaret's breath quickened. She fought harder, refusing to let them all disappear into the depths of the Dral'nor's collective. She reached out, touching the edges of their minds, pulling them back from the brink. "We are still here," she whispered in her own mind, unsure if anyone else could hear. "We are still human. Fight. Hold on." A sliver of clarity pierced through the fog of their consciousness. Robert's voice cracked through the haze, faint but present. "Margaret, it's too late for us. You have to go. Save yourself." "No." Margaret shouted silently. She could feel her own sense of self beginning to slip, her thoughts twisting into foreign shapes. But the small embers of resistance in her team gave her hope. They were still there, somewhere beneath the waves of alien thought. If she could just keep them tethered to themselves for a little longer, maybe they could all escape. As the team struggled against the encroaching tide of Dral'nor minds, Margaret's thoughts drifted deeper into the abyss of their collective consciousness. The more she resisted, the more she understood, slowly, horrifyingly, what the Dral'nor were. They had absorbed countless species before, not to learn from them, but to strip them of their identities, to dominate and control. The Dral'nor were not a race of scholars, but conquerors. They viewed the consciousness of other beings as tools to expand their own knowledge and power, assimilating them into an endless collective mind. Their apparent benevolence had been nothing more than a facade to lure in new species for absorption. The truth was darker than anything Margaret had ever anticipated. There was a fragment of memory, not her own, but that of an ancient alien civilization, the ruins of which now lay submerged in the deepest trenches of Aquaelon's oceans. They had been consumed. Their culture, their entire way of life, had been reduced to nothing but a whisper in the Dral'nor's vast collective. The civilizations that had come before, the minds they had absorbed, were no longer distinguishable from the Dral'nor themselves. The truth was terrifying. The Dral'nor had been using the spirit transfer process for eons, not to exchange knowledge, but to erase and enslave entire species. The process was a form of consumption. A species would be allowed to merge with the Dral'nor for a time, but only to be consumed wholly once their minds were weakened, their individuality destroyed. The humans hadn't been chosen as guests of honor. They had been chosen as the next to be devoured. The realization sent a wave of panic through Margaret's mind. She could feel the Dral'nor's presence encroaching on her, and the pressure to lose herself grew unbearable. But there was something else, a spark. It came from the fragmented pieces of her team's consciousness, reaching out, touching the edges of her own mind. They were still there, somewhere deep inside the collective. She couldn't give up. A memory surfaced, an old, faded moment of her childhood. A warm day in the park, her mother's hand holding hers tightly, the smell of fresh grass in the air. The memory was hers. The sensations were hers. It reminded her that she was more than just a mind adrift in an ocean. She was Margaret Ellis. We are human, she thought. We can resist. Margaret reached out, focusing all of her willpower on the fracture within the Dral'nor's collective consciousness. The Dral'nor believed their mind transfer process was flawless, a seamless integration of minds. But there were cracks, small imperfections in their otherwise perfect system. The key was to exploit these cracks, to disrupt the process before they could finish consuming her and her team. She dug deeper, pulling at the seams of the Dral'nor's consciousness. There was resistance, a sharp pain in her mind as the Dral'nor fought back. The strain was unbearable, but Margaret held on, focusing on the flickering remnants of her crew's thoughts. If she could just break free from the Dral'nor's grasp, if they could just hold on to themselves for one more moment. With a final burst of strength, Margaret focused all her energy on the crack in the Dral'nor's collective. Her thoughts collided with theirs, the sound of shattering consciousness filling her mind. The ocean of stars that had once seemed so infinite and beautiful now felt suffocating, as though it were collapsing in on her. But she pushed through, refusing to let the Dral'nor win. Suddenly, the pressure lifted. Margaret gasped for air, though she hadn't been breathing. The sensation was like emerging from beneath the surface of water, her body and mind suddenly free. For a moment, the world was still. And then the others, Matthew, Robert, and Helena, came back. Their voices, weak but clear, echoed through her mind. We made it, Matthew whispered. They had escaped. The link to the Dral'nor's consciousness was broken. The process had been disrupted, but they were not unscathed. Their minds felt different, fragile, as though something deep inside them had been irreversibly changed. They were no longer just the humans they had been. They were survivors. But at what cost? As the team returned to the physical world, they found themselves in the quiet, eerie calm of Aquaelon's ocean station. The Dral'nor's presence was no longer in their minds, but the memories lingered. Their bodies were exhausted, their minds scarred by the experience. The flood of alien memories, the overwhelming emotions, and the fear of losing their identities all weighed heavily on them. "We've won," Margaret said quietly, though her voice held little conviction. She looked out at the endless expanse of water beyond their station, the vast ocean that had once seemed so mysterious and beautiful. Now, it felt like a graveyard, silent, unforgiving. But they had survived. They had won, for now. Yet Margaret knew, deep in her soul, that the Dral'nor would not give up. They had already absorbed countless species, and the Dral'nor's hunger for knowledge, for power, was insatiable. They would come again, and next time, humanity would be ready. The team returned to Earth, but none of them would ever be the same. Their memories, altered by the Dral'nor's consciousness, now held dark secrets, secrets of civilizations lost to the ocean of stars. The knowledge they had gained was dangerous. It was a gift, but also a curse. Margaret stood alone at the window, looking out into the stars. The vastness of space, once a symbol of exploration and wonder, now felt like a void. An endless ocean, teeming with the unknown. And she knew one thing for sure. The ocean of stars would never stop calling.